I'm Howard Friedman, and I'm the director of the Jewish Community Library in San Francisco, which is a program of Jewish Learning Works. And I want to welcome you to this evening's program with Ephraim Margolin. I would like to thank our co-presenter for this event, Congregation Beth Shalom in San Francisco. And I want to thank the Friends of the Jewish Community Library for making all of what we do possible. If you'd like to help keep the library serving the community, please consider becoming a friend of the library at www.friendsofthejcl.org. During this evening's program, everybody will be muted except for Ephraim Margolin. However, there will be opportunities for questions at the end. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can go ahead and type it in the chat, and I will convey the question to Ephraim after his presentation concludes. A number of people have asked whether we would be canceling tonight's talk in light of today's horrifying events in Washington, D.C., and we decided not to. What happens today becomes the stuff of tomorrow's history books. And just as it's our duty to learn about and respond to current events, it's our responsibility to learn about the past if we are to safeguard our freedoms and the political systems that protect them. In his foreword to Julius Margolin's memoir, Yale historian Timothy Snyder writes, Margolin thought that democracy transcended a shallow quarrel between right and left. The right was not bound to defend fascism, and the left was not bound to defend the Soviet Union. And no one was bound to identify with right or left. The trap of us and them was dehumanizing. What humanized was an active moral concern for truth, access to the historical record, and the freedom to express what was learned. And this is part of why this book is so important. I came to know Ephraim Margolin through his Yom Kippur talks at Congregation Beth Shalom, which he's been giving for more than 50 years. I've long appreciated the opportunity to learn from a deep philosopher of secular law and Jewish law, of Zionism and political philosophy, and of Torah. And part of Ephraim's wisdom comes from living through and absorbing history, from coming of age in pre-war Poland and pre-state Tel Aviv, from serving as Menachem Begin's personal secretary in the late 1940s, from clerking for the Israeli Supreme Court, from participating as an attorney in major civil rights and criminal cases in the United States, and more. I feel privileged to have had the opportunity to learn from him and to continue to have it tonight. Ephraim's father, Julius Margolin's memoir, Journey to the Land of Zeks, is one of the most important documents of this terrible era that it portrays. We have in the Jewish Community Library a French language copy of it. We have a Polish language copy. We have it in Hebrew, we have it in German, but I have felt vicariously Ephraim's pain during these years in the knowledge that his father's masterwork has not been available to English readers. But more than 70 years after the book's original publication, that day has come. This is what some of us call a Shehechianu moment, and it's very poignant for me to see this day and to be able to share it with Ephraim. I will now turn the screen over to Ephraim Margolin.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I want to show you one picture from the book. At the very top, you will see the picture of three people. The little one, that's me. I am 3 years old. The picture was taken in Łódź, Poland. And this is my mother and my father. I am here to tell you about a brilliant writer and his main book, Journey into the Land of Zeks and Back. Almost half a century after he died, my father's book saw its first light in English. The book was reprinted a dozen times in the original Russian, in German, in Polish, in French, and in Hebrew. Stephanie Hoffman of the Hebrew University excellently translated my father's book into English, and Oxford Press beautifully published it. Good books are very rare. This book is unique. My father, Jewish native of Pinsk in Poland, earned a doctorate in Berlin. He was a Western European Jewish intellect caught in the tragedy of our people between Nazi and Soviet horrors. In his book, after describing Poland under Nazis in 1939, when they invaded, Father describes the less known Soviet variety of this dark age. When the world did not know it and did not want to know it, his book came in. His book documents the horror of his 7-year odyssey, gulags, as part of an autocratic, deadly Soviet system. In 1936, my father sent me and my mother to settle in Palestine. We settled in Tel Aviv. It saved us from the Shoah. He visited us in 1937 in Tel Aviv. We visited him in the summer of 1938 in Łódź. On November 3, 1939, he was to join us permanently in Tel Aviv. Germans invaded Poland on November 1, 2 days before his departure. He eluded the Germans. Soviets invaded Poland from the west, and considering him and countless other Polish citizens socially dangerous element, they took him away from us for 7 years. We do not know what kept him away, whether he was alive. If so, where? Whether he was dead. I felt fatherless in my entire adolescence and almost had to be introduced to him when we met again. Both my parents were Zionists. In 1936, Father borrowed money from my affluent uncle in New York, then in Łódź, to send my mother and me to Palestine. In exchange for the loan, my father agreed to remain in Łódź for 3 more years, managing my uncle's business. His own arrival in Palestine was set for September 3, 1939. Germans invaded Poland on November 1. Like many Zionists, my uncle stayed in Poland until the last minute. He escaped to London and then to America on the last plane from Vilnius, then Vilna. Father also escaped from Łódź, but Poland's borders were blocked. Not a single country in the world welcomed Jews in our hour of need. Father, unable to cross the sealed Romanian border, which we crossed traveling to and from Poland in 1936 and in 1938, had no place and no way to leave Poland. Soviets just invaded Poland from the west, and it was the only way he could flee from the Germans. In the Soviet Pinsk, my father was arrested, given a secret quote, trial, unquote, and vanished. His existence was erased. Over 5 years later, we have discovered that he and many other vanishing Jews were sent in bolted boxcars 1,000 kilometers away to Karlovina in Soviet subarctic. In 1940, we did not know what happened to my father. As I said, he disappeared. Was he alive? Where? Was he dead? Where? When? There was no way to find any detail about it. We received no letters. We received no telegrams, no hints, no rumors. We had no address to write to. My mother and I were left alone in Tel Aviv. In 1943, 4 years after my father disappeared, Polish General Anders, his army, arrived in Palestine. My mother started to advertise in Polish newspapers for any witness who may have known where father was. Such adverts were common at the time. My father's disappearance was not unique. 60 different people responded to my mother's request for information, offering tea and babkas. It's like cookies in America, but it's babkas in Tel Aviv. Some claimed that my father was dead. Some described where he was buried. Some reported mistaken identity. Margolins. There are many Margolins. I believe that one of them is listening to me today, but I never met him. Others came just for the tea and the babkas. Finally, a year later, one responder told my mother about a Gulag where he, quote, met my father, unquote. On this testimony, mother started to send food packages to that Gulag, not knowing whether any parcels would ever reach him. What was a Gulag anyway? There was no answer from the Gulag. More than 2 years later, more than 5 years after my father disappeared, my mother suddenly received a telegram, quote, love, 6 packages arrived, Yuli, unquote. My father was alive. This was the first indication we had in 5 years that my father was still alive. Now let me go to the book. Soviet system mandated forced slave labor. Slave labor, overwork, and inadequate food. In 1941, that's a year after he arrived there, the Russians were meager. Slaves failing or just meeting their work quotas were to be given 500 grams of black bread a day. Considering minimal food intake for normal body function, neither could survive long. Those who exceeded the norm by 125% received macaroni, peas, and rotten horse meat. Those who fulfilled 150% of their quote were named Stakhanovites and survived on 900 grams of black bread, given 2-3 times a day. All food decisions were arbitrary. Late arrival meant no food at all, even if it is arrival from work. Punishments also denied food. Father believed that to work normally, one must eat normally. He was right. It was the system that was inhumanly wrong. When Germans invaded Russia, the food rations got even less than what I just told you. 90% of Westerners in the Gulag swiftly perished. My father, a philosopher who knew no physical labor, was assigned to tree cutting. All Western Zeks were given this assignment regardless of their past training and health. Stakhanovites were given best tools, the choice of whatever was available. My father was given what was left. It was 10 hours in the forest every day, plus marching to the forest for arrival and back for departure. Physical labor from wake up to night, long march into forest, cutting and logging trees and transporting them. Return, suffering cold with one's clothes shriveled, without boots in snow. The leader would instruct the workers, quote, "No speaking or I shoot without warning," unquote. There were no excuses. Quote, "Work. If you don't work, you don't eat," unquote. Slogans covered up on dehumanization. Irks, professional criminals, regularly attacked Zeks, both food and possession, and person. Father's glasses were seized for ransom and broken. Words fail to describe it. The system of gulags rested on unbearable, persistent, and endless forced labor and starvation. The result were malnutrition, illness like scurvy, tuberculosis, ulcers, gradual wasting away, a loss of identity, and death. People stole from each other, informed on each other, vandalized and brutalized each other, succumbed to starvation and died. overseers displayed astonishing ignorance resulting from the managerial education system in the USSR. Father tried to explain that he was not anti-Soviet, that he was a Polish resident of Palestine, where his family lived, that he was on the way to his family when the Nazis invaded. But his bosses were ignorant. After Father's effort to explain his innocence, one boss still believed that Palestine was part of Germany, that marriages can be interrupted at boss's will without need for any letters or notices to the spouse, and that Father's training and knowledge were irrelevant. The book is full of inquiries, such as, what is a schnitzel? Is grass edible? Can we eat grass? Work norms were designed to be insufficient, inhuman. This is what mattered in the Gulag. My father was hospitalized repeatedly for dying of malnutrition. Doctors gave him 3 months to live. Doctors were the most sympathetic Soviet characters around. A Jewish doctor, the name does not appear in the book, but it was Dr. Berger from Lithuania. A Jewish doctor saved my father's life. Look, the doctor told me, my father writes, here are 2 identical cases, you and your neighbor. You both have 3 months to live. It is irresponsible to save both of you. For that, we need special conditions. For one situation, however, it is still possible. By collecting the leftovers, the swaps, the occasional extras, I could cut out something from my own ration, not eat enough myself. Somehow, for one, we could scrape by. I can't do it for 2. What should I do? I must choose one of you. Your neighbor has no family, no one will mourn him. You have a family waiting for you. I choose you, unquote. The doctor and his assistant both contributed part of their own food. Father lived. His neighbor died. Another doctor, evaluating my father, remarked, scurvy, ulcer, very good. For that meant that he could assign my father as an invalid. And as an invalid, he will feed a little bit better. Thank God, said my father, I was an invalid. In 1944, a military doctor refused to certify my father suitable for Polish military service. With the establishment of communist Polish government, Soviets allowed Polish citizens to return to Poland. Nobody else could return from the Soviet Union. To gain the right to leave the Soviet Union for Poland, father offered to join the Polish army. But military doctor refused to certify that he was suitable for the military service. Quote, "You are a basket case," unquote, declared the doctor. The doctor prescribed 6 months in a rest home with extra nutritious food, and even then it is not clear whether you will get back on your feet, unquote. The doctor was a good person. She did what she could, but as soon as she was away, all she did was lost. Nothing changed. Poland-bound father was sent instead north to Kotlas and Altai, beyond the Arctic Circle, by train. Father, whose weight in Łódź was 80 kilo, was 45 kilo now. The trip was a nightmare. For 3 days, his food ration was forcefully taken by anti-Semitic Irks on the train, friends of his boss. Until my father rebelled, demanded to be released from the train where he was brutalized and about to be killed. He was let go after all his money was taken away by the boss, confiscated. He was released to Poland, and the book does not tell about the rest of the trip back to Poland. It is amazing that mid suffering and hospitalizations, my father recited Catullus' poem, Hamsun's writings, and French philosophers. There are philosophical arguments in mid-text, like his disagreement with Dostoevsky's writings about camp neurosis. Without paper or pencils, father wrote several books: Dialectic of Hate, The Theory of Life, The Theory of Lie, The Doctrine of Hate, about freedom. None of these books survived. In an aside, with failed irony, father delivered one manuscript to the authorities, explaining its intellectual significance and arguing that it could be destroyed by Irks where he slept every night. The surprised authorities, who never had something like that happen to them before, asked their superiors what to do. Use it as paper in the outhouse, was the answer. My mother tried to restore father's British visa to Palestine, which he could not use in 1939 because the Nazis invaded Poland. In teeth of a full year of British recalcitrance, nothing happened. My uncle in New York unsuccessfully tried to get my father a visa to Honduras. He was unsuccessful. Luckily, a year later, the British finally approved the reissue of father's visa which they granted him in 1939. After many delays, my father joined us in Haifa in 1946. He was 45 years old. His hair was white, except for a red mustache. Half his teeth were missing. His innards were permanently compromised. But he was optimistic and energetic as ever. I had difficulty relating to my father. I last saw him in 1938. I was 11. I next saw him 8 years later. I lived fatherless for 8 years. Father rushed to meet the Berger family in Haifa to tell them about Dr. Berger, who saved his life in the Gulag. Father thought that the Bergers, like the Margolins, faced a vanishing relative and had no way to know whether and where Dr. Berger may be alive. Dr. Berger was a Lithuanian Jew, not a Pole, so the Soviets would not let him leave the USSR. And there he died. Alas, Berger family in Haifa were communists. They told my father that my father was a liar. There were no gulags in the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was a paradise country. Even if Dr. Berger was in prison, he probably deserved being there. Father returned to Tel Aviv, shocked, and set to write the book we are reviewing today. For an entire 1946, Father left our apartment each morning for 2 or 3 hours alone in a Tel Aviv cafe to write this book. He wrote in minuscule shrift, filling pages with microscopic, tiny Russian letters. In the evening, he would read whatever he had written regularly. We had several friends at dinner to hear him read his draft in Russian and discuss it with them. In 1947, the book was published in Russian in America by the Ford Foundation under the name of Krylov Publishing House. It was abbreviated with most Jewish references omitting. For some reason, this is how Ford Foundation wanted it. In the Soviet Union, the book was repeatedly reprinted in samizdat. Samizdat is individuals copying and privately distributing what they copied. With Russian Jews immigrating to Israel, the book was reprinted in Israel several times in its original Russian. My father became a hero of many Russian Jews in the Soviet Union and as they came to Israel in Tel Aviv. In those days, no one wanted to read about wrongs in the Soviet Union. They were our allies in World War II. The new state of Israel also saw Russia as an ally. They did not want to see anything else. The Zionist leadership of the state, almost all of whom read Russian at the time, congratulated my father about his book, but little was said in public. Haaretz published 4 articles. The book was published in English this year because it is a masterpiece, literary and historical. We were lucky to get Misha Shauli, to get Stephanie to translate it, and the Oxford University Press to recognize its value. It is a witness statement, beautifully written, like a great history it is, like a treasure it is. It is relevant to today's arguments in America about authoritarianism and radiant in its trust in Western democracy. It is especially amazing that in the last 6 chapters of the book, my father, on his way to Palestine, described himself not as a survivor, not as the wrong intellectual back from hell, but as a free, unaltered, unbroken, sexual man in his 40s. Father's book never descends to propaganda. It is an evidentiary transcript by a Western man who was able to adapt despite unbelievable hardships, was lucky to find help, and survived again and again to tell us that there is evil aboard, and our job is to survive and prevent it. I am amazed at how detailed my father could write the book. He had no paper, he had no pen, he had no pencils. How did he do it? Because the book has names of people and characters of people and difficulties of people and where and what the people did if they lived. Oxford Press, Stephanie Hoffman's excellent translation. Misha Shauli, the chief of the marvelous band of father's friends who published his books in Israel when no one else would do so. It is good that the book closes with 6 short chapters of father's road back to the West. I love his recollection of the Western women, women who, unlike the Gulag women, did not demand that he, quote, not come closer, unquote. Women who made him feel, quote, a male, a vibrant, healthy, and free male, unquote. For this was an integral part of his surviving the Gulag experience. He felt no longer a beast. He was no longer a beast. He was able to feel warm reunion with our relatives, Sanya and Nina, in Paris. There is vitality even in commenting that women in Łódź were a world beyond Soviet life. Women in Paris were a world beyond Łódź. Tel Aviv, I believe, was a world beyond Paris. There is vitality in this gradual recovery from the Gulag. There is vitality in the gradual return from Łódź to Paris to Marseille and to Haifa. There is vitality in survival. The terrible land of gulags remained a forbidding memory, for there is nothing that changed there. In 1951, my father followed the book by testifying in a Paris public trial that gulags existed, and those who denied them simply lied. My father was not anti-Soviet before he became one. I remember my father's reading me from a Russian story when I was little. It was a book called Mr. Twister, Bivshy Minister. Mr. Twister, who once was a Secretary of State. It was written by a Jewish communist whose name I do not recall. It tells about a bigoted American millionaire who learns to respect other races after trip to Russia. USSR in that book stresses integration. That was meant to make us believe that we shared common ideals, that maybe we are not that different from each other. Portraying it as our sisters in idealism, but in the 1970s, I went to Riga as a representative of the local bar association in San Francisco to inquire about another trial of a Soviet Jew who wanted to live with his family for Israel. But in that case, all defense witnesses were deported 2,000 kilometers away before the trial. I barely escaped deportation myself for registering with the court and asking the court for information about that trial. I acted like my father's son. I hoped to emulate him. In telling you today what I am telling you now, abbreviating it and trying not to talk too much about the horrors of the Gulag, I am doing the same. And I must say, it is a good book. I am ready to answer questions.
So if people can put any questions that they may have in the chat, and then I will relay them. I guess maybe I'll start off with a question about what you saw in terms of the psychological toll that took on your father's subsequent life, and maybe also on your family, what he had experienced.
Well, my father discusses at length and in several different locations what happens when people are starving. What happens when people are given more difficult work that they cannot handle, but no food? How they become beasts. There is the fact that we in America who never seen a gulag just cannot believe it. It is terribly difficult to accept that here you are in Poland or anywhere else in Europe. The Nazis come, you escape. By being an escapee, you are dangerous to the Soviet Union. By just escaping the Nazis, you will end up in a gulag. Your verdicts will come in before the trial. Everything will be quiet and secret. Your wife cannot know that you are alive. Just think about it, because my mother is a hero of war. My mother ended up from having a kindergarten and being interested in children and educating children. My mother was left in Tel Aviv with me as a child, alone. She started to work physical labor. And that was 8 years that I did not see my father, and she did not see him. And how did she survive it? You think about it, and then you think, well, there was war too. Lots of people died, lots of people were hurt. So your mother is one of them, and she lived. So maybe it's not so terrible. But just try to think that suddenly everybody you know disappears. Suddenly, you don't have money. Suddenly, you are set to work. And not only do you survive and your son is sent to a school and survives, but the house becomes the basis for refugees who just came from all over to have a place which is warm, and there is food, and there are people, and you are welcome. I think that my mother should have written a book. I'm sorry she didn't. But
Thank you. So I got a question from Yochanan, who asks, what most helped Ephraim's father persevere to survive? Was it because he wanted to be a witness or to see his family again, or something else?
well, when you read the book, you find very, very little about his wife and about his child. When you are dying of starvation and unable to lug the trees you were supposed to lug, you don't really think about, I have to live for my wife, I have to live for my son. You come close to being a beast. That's his point. He gives names of number of people who we knew and who ended up in the Soviet Union, and who, including my father, stole for a living, defended his food allocation against other thieves, was in an impossible situation for years without ever having any hope of getting out of that hell. What made him? He was lucky. He was adaptable. He was lucky. And I think that he lived much of his life in his books, because I cannot imagine anybody in his condition talking about Catullus. I didn't read Catullus at my age. I just never read him. If he told me Dante, I can understand. But Catullus, the book is filled of philosophical remarks which come from a Western educated man who was born in Pinsk. Oh my God. A little boy from Pinsk on a scholarship in a German university, getting his doctorate, speaking 13 languages and learning more. I mean, that was my father.
Thank you. So Stuart writes, many Jews and Poles, like my mother and her family, were released from their gulags, and the men in their family were made Polish Soviet soldiers shortly after Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. Your father was kept in the gulag until 1944. Do you know why he was not forced into the army in 1941 or 1942?
First of all, when the Polish army arrived, we did not know where he was. My mother had to advertise in a newspaper for anybody who met a Margolin, a Dr. Margolin. As I told you, 60 different people responded. Only one of them had the answer. And then he was not allowed to go to Poland, to leave the Soviet Union, because the Russians could not believe that a Jew can be a Polish citizen. It took a long time. He produced documentation before, in the final account, they allowed him to move, and then they sent him to the north instead of sending him to Poland. It took a very long time for him to get out of there, which makes me think of all the people he describes who did not get out. You know, I have 2 grandchildren. How do I tell them these stories? How can you tell anybody what this really is? My father did, but he was an incredible writer.
We have a question asking for more about what it was like when he joined you in Tel Aviv, about his state of the kindness, bitterness. Was he remote? Was he loving? What that experience was from your perspective?
Well, we went to Haifa to meet the ship when he arrived. My mother was there most of the time. The 2 of them were together. I was looking at this man and trying to tell myself, do I remember him? Is that what he looked like? He looked different. My father wooed me. That's the only way I can describe it. And let me explain to you what happened to me ultimately. Because the father always tried to get close to me. I had difficulty relating. Then I ended up in America. Then I ended up at Yale Law School. Then my father came to visit me at Yale Law School. And on the way to Yosemite, where I took to show him Yosemite, we passed Manteca. You still pass Manteca now if you go to Yosemite. My father in Manteca started telling me about his professors at the university. I was unable to listen to this. I was thinking to myself, this is a world I don't belong in. He is trying to rub it in that he is so brilliant. And then it suddenly hit me. My father was not wooing me. That was my egotism that went there. My father was trying to explain to me that he has a doctorate, that he was a successful writer. And then I started laughing, and he said, "What are you laughing?" And I told him, "Daddy, I am successful. I am a very successful lawyer. I graduated Yale Law School. I could tell you about my professors. I could do the same thing, just to tell you that, hey, I am worth something. Just to tell you that you should love me." And my father started laughing when I told him that, and we became friends.
Thank you. So we have a question from Lydia, who's she's reflecting on the Polish translation that she read, which she cherishes, and she notes that it does not include the last chapters of Coming Back to Israel, and she wonders whether the present English edition is the fullest version of your father's memoir.
The English version is full. The last 6 chapters were added from a different book. They were put together so that you have both the disappearance and the reappearance in one book. The Polish book was published long before. It was published as a result of the French, who published his book to enormous reaction. And as a result of the reaction the book got in Paris, they handled the German and the Polish books. But then later on, they did not have the contact with English-speaking world. And that took a long time. And Shauli is the one who found the present translator. And as soon as we found her, we hired her, and she translated the book. And I am very grateful. I never met her, but I am very grateful to her. And someday when I go back to visit Israel again, I hope to see her again.
So Susie Colliver asks, what made her, with Stephanie Huffman, an appropriate translator for the book?
The book is a great book. It's simply a good book. There aren't many like it. There may be a lot of people who are not interested in the subject, who do not want to read anything that's wrong about the Soviet Union. But most people who are interested in it find the book unsurpassable. And that's Solzhenitsyn, who was 15 years later after my father's book came out, included. It's a really good book. And, I hunt for good books. But reading whatever I can put my hands on, I don't find very many that were worth reading. His book is. It's a very difficult book. Some people will not like what they read about the Soviet Union. But it happens to be true. And after the books came out, we heard from a large number of people, two of whom, at least the two that I know, are listening today to my talk. They had the same experience or a very similar one. They just did not write the book my father wrote. So I am grateful to my father, and I'm grateful to be able to say good things about him. He was a good guy.
So this may be our last question. How much has the current world improved in avoiding such mistreatment to innocent people? And as your father's son, what, if anything, can be done to repair this world?
Well, I cannot say that nothing really changed in the Soviet Union. But in my single trip there, as I told you, to check on another trial, in the single trip I took, I would not like to live there. I think that it is a place in which many things that are important to me simply almost do not exist, such as just talking, such as just exchanging ideas, such as on occasion, it's okay to be wrong. The situation in Russia is terrible, but I don't want to talk about it because my knowledge is so spasmodic. And secondly, because we don't have good or very good news in America today. The question of a country which chooses to be governed in a way in which individuals don't matter, to me, is anathema. I find that it's easier for me not to want to go to visit Germany again. I don't ever want to see Germany again. But I did go to Russia. And I did go to Russia to find out what's happening there. It was still USSR. And now what I read is when people who disagree with the leadership are poisoned. What can we do? I cannot even tell you what we can do in America. I spent most of my life after Israel, I spent on constitutional law in this country. Time and again, trying to create new approaches, new laws, new realities for people who needed it. Now that I am retired, I am looking at my president, the going out president, and I have real questions. I like what he did by sending the embassy to Jerusalem. And I cannot trust him 1 minute for where he will be on this subject tomorrow. So I cannot tell you what we can do, but I can tell you that if you do what I tried to do, and this is spend your life trying to develop American constitutional law, you are doing something for America. You are doing something for humanity. And the only other thing I could recommend is read the book.
Thank you so much, Ephraim. This was a real privilege to be with you. I also see that that the editor of the book for Oxford University Press is with us, and I actually want, as a librarian, to express my gratitude, because I know what it takes to create a book, and we're very, very grateful for its existence. And again, thank you everybody for being with us, especially on this very difficult day. It's a day that will be remembered in American history. And I want us also to remember this evening spent with you, Ephraim, because you're a treasure. Your father was a treasure. This book is a treasure, and we're very grateful. So thanks everybody. Be well, be safe, and let's all hope for the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.